inviting me. I guess I would call myself a fourth stakeholder. I'm not a theorist. I'm a filmmaker. And my entry point to these stories and these issues and ideas are really more personal, emotional. I'm interested in lived experience of people, of women. And from that kind of concrete, trying to locate a larger social meaning. So I'm going to present a work in progress today, Mas Bebes. It's a film that I'm producing with Virginia Espino, who's here in the Center for Oral History Research. And it actually originates from her research into this case of Mexican origin women in the 1960s and 70s who were coercively sterilized at Los Angeles County Hospital. And this is during a time that poor women were being coercively sterilized all over the country. Typically, the women would be in labor. They'd arrive at the hospital, they were told, or prearranged, they had to have an emergency C-section, which meant they were in some sort of distress, and they were prodded somehow during that time in labor, sometimes the late stages of labor, to sign consent forms. In some cases, the women don't even remember signing consent forms. They remember things like being told they might be deported if they didn't sign. Many of them were on Demerol, epidurals. Many of them were hemorrhaging. If you've ever been in labor, actually, if you've ever been in labor, I would have agreed to be permanently sterilized. But this resulted in a class action lawsuit and a protest campaign, and really galvanized the rise of Chicana feminism here in Los Angeles. So Los Angeles County Hospital, as you know, is in the east side. Then and now largely low-income immigrant population. It was at that time a top research hospital. It was run by E.J. Quilligan, the head of OBGYN, who came from Yale. He was the chair of the Yale Medical School. Daniel Michel, who was a leading figure in the Population Council then and now, a leading figure in family planning. And so simultaneously, in a very interesting way at the hospital, they were advancing women's reproductive health, while at the same time subjecting women to testing and to these kinds of procedures like the sterilizations. So, and when Susan talked about this Waddington's idea and this disconnect, I thought of all the interviews I've been doing with both women who were sterilized and the doctors who performed the sterilizations. And there was such a disconnect in their kind of lived experience of those tubal ligations and also their perception of what happened and how it happened. So again, this was the golden age of family planning. You know, women were being provided with contraception. You know, it was available and accessible to low-income women for the first time. It was the era of Roe v. Wade. So the film really calls to the question, what is choice? What does choice mean? And in this case, even in their relationship to giving birth in the hospital, also the relationship to resistance to coercive sterilization. The Mexican origin women, poor women on the east side were being devalued. For example, white feminists at that time did not, the local chapter of NOW did not want to participate in the anti-sterilization abuse campaign because one thing that Chicana feminists are calling for is a 72-hour waiting period. In other words, if you sign a consent form while you're in the late stages of labor, the assumption is, well, maybe you're not in the right line to actually give informed consent. So give a woman a few days to really think about it. But these feminists were worried that it would affect abortion on demand and sterilization on demand, and we're not really looking at, in a reproductive justice framework, the intersectionality of race, class, citizenship, and all these other factors with reproductive choice. Radical feminists sometimes refuse to join actions, protest actions, because there were men involved with the action. So in terms of Chicana feminism, looking at things not only as this case as gendered, but also racialized. There was, again, that kind of disconnect and devaluing. As today in the 503 Hyde Amendment, poor women were, advocates for poor women were asked not to bring up public funding for abortions at the risk of jeopardizing the whole healthcare reform effort. Anyway, that's a digression. So just a little bit about the origin story of the film itself is, it really began when Virginia is my neighbor in Mount Washington. And when our children were small, we have boys about the same age, we would have play dates and she would talk about her research, and she told me about this case. And as a new mother, I was just astounded. I mean, just the idea that my fertility and my choice can be butchered at such a time of vulnerability was appalling to me. So I had this real visceral kind of reaction to the stories of these women. And at the same time, I had been making films for years and years about migration, about separation, loss, and this sense of dislocation of people I was filming, and I was really frustrated. How do you speak to the unspeakable? How do you really tell that stories without just, more tears and, a lot of witness? And so I was trying to search for sort of a visual language that would speak to this idea of what's not visible to the camera, to this presence of absence. And one wonderful thing about the social documentary process, which is drawing from social theory to inform the documentary practice, is being surrounded in an intellectual community like this community, and that's something I enjoy at UC Santa Cruz. And so I discovered, the people were thinking about mourning and loss, of work of people like Avery Gordon, who looked at these historic sites of trauma, like the abandoned hospital. If you go to the east side, that old women's hospital and general hospital it's still standing, but abandoned. I actually filmed there a couple of times. But those sites are haunted in a way with these ghosts who are social figures. These ghosts who remain there, their traces of their lived experience remain there, and they demand to be heard, they demand justice. And so that led me to Toni Morrison's Beloved, if you remember that novel of a woman who was a slave who escapes with her 2 children, and the slaveholder finds her. I think she escapes to Ohio, Cincinnati. They come back to bring her back to Kentucky, to the plantation, and rather than take her child back into slavery, she murders her child. And so one of the central figures of the book is that murdered child, the voice and the presence of that murdered child who demands to be heard and who demands justice. And I thought, that's so, for me as a filmmaker, that's so liberating. I kind of traffic in, what's there and interviews with people who are alive, but this idea that these unborn children, and all the women talk about dreaming of these unborn children, the children they never had. And I thought that was very interesting as well, because when you look at the whole call for choice, defining choice in the eyes of these women, choice meaning not only the right to terminate a pregnancy, but the right also to bring a pregnancy to term. I thought this idea of these unborn children was a real interesting kind of appropriation of pro-life iconography. So that kind of brought me to a, as a filmmaker, I don't really kind of go to influence my films or shape my films, look at a canon of previous films. But, just kind of, by any means necessary, I just kind of look wherever I can find some kind of inspiration. Carrie Mae Weems, the photography of Carrie Mae Weems and Lorna Simpson was another place I looked, in addition to Beloved. Actually, Avery Gordon and many of these theorists took me to Beloved, then took me to Carrie Mae Weems and Lorna Simpson. And if you remember Lorna Simpson's photograph of the water bearer, it's a figure of a woman, and she's in this white ship. And as soon as I saw it, it read to me some, in a way, motherhood and life, but also a shroud. So that kind of image of the figure in white is really interesting to me. And just this kind of idea of loss and agency at the same time. When I show you a clip, you'll see the first image is actually I shot around Evergreen Cemetery in Boyle Heights. And there's a jogging track around the cemetery. And every afternoon, families go out and take a stroll and people jog around the cemetery. And I thought, that's just an incredible, incredible image. Another kind of source of inspiration was Alex Rivera's Sleep Dealer, which is really a brilliant film, and it's sort of his imagination of what happens if the nativist dream comes to fruition. So that the workers, instead of migrating here across the border to the United States, the workers in Mexico go to these factories, virtual factories on the border in Tijuana or wherever, and they operate these robots that are in the United States, and the robots are the nannies, and they're doing construction and they're doing gardening, but these braceros, which means arms, literally, are operating those virtual workers. And so it's this persistent anxiety we've always had. We want the labor, but we don't want the people, and that's kind of and that's also, I think, the framework of what was going on in the sterilizations at LA County Hospital. So I guess we should go to the videotape. So this is it's a film I just finished shooting in December. I'm just editing now. If most of you are more traditional academics, so it's sort of like a first draft writing a paper. So, I have to make all the technical excuses. And there are 10 tracks. If you recognize music from Motorcycle Diaries and things like this, because I'm just kind of stealing the CDs until I have my own composer. But so this is just one section of about a 10-minute clip from one section of the film, and you'll meet some of the women, some of the principal people involved in the case.